Dog sneaks into hospital each night. Doctor discovers the heartbreaking truth. The quiet corridors of the St. Augustine General Hospital were a stark contrast to the bustling streets outside. Late at night, when the last of the visitors had gone and the nurses made their rounds, the hospital settled into an eerie stillness. It was during these hours that Dr. Rebecca Harper often found solace in the quiet, using the time to catch up on paperwork or check on her patients without distraction. But recently, something unusual had been happening during these tranquil nights. Security had reported strange sightings. A dog, sleek and brown, slipping through the automatic doors and wandering the halls as if it belonged there. The reports puzzled Rebecca, and at first she dismissed them as exaggerations. After all, how could a stray dog manage to enter a secure hospital? Yet the stories persisted. Nurses whispered about seeing the dog curled in corners, its eyes alert yet gentle. Janitors swore they'd caught glimpses of it slipping into patient rooms only to disappear moments later. And though the dog never caused any harm, its presence raised questions Rebecca couldn't ignore. One night, as a thunderstorm raged outside and the hospital lights flickered faintly, Rebecca decided to investigate. Armed with a flashlight and a growing curiosity, she made her way through the quiet halls, her footsteps echoing softly against the linoleum floors. She found the dog in the pediatric ward, lying at the foot of a child's bed. The boy, no older than 6, was fast asleep, his small hand resting on the edge of the mattress. The dog, a mixed breed with soulful brown eyes, looked up as Rebecca entered, its gaze calm but guarded. For a moment, neither moved. Rebecca crouched slowly, her voice soft. "Hey there, buddy. What are you doing here?" The dog didn't flinch. It simply stared at her, its eyes filled with an emotion Rebecca couldn't quite place. Sadness, perhaps, or longing. It wasn't the look of a stray scavenging for food or warmth. This dog had a purpose. Rebecca inched closer, careful not to startle it. The dog remained still, its body relaxed but watchful. She reached out a hand, palm up, and waited. After a long moment, the dog leaned forward, sniffing her fingers before resting its head on her hand. "You're not lost, are you?" Rebecca murmured, her heart softening. "You came here for a reason." The next morning, Rebecca shared her discovery with the hospital staff. While some were amused by the dog's persistence, others were concerned about the potential risks of an animal wandering the halls. The head of security, Mr. Lopez, was particularly vocal. "We can't have a stray dog sneaking in every night," he said, his tone firm. "What if it's carrying diseases? Or worse, what if it bites someone?" Rebecca understood his concerns, but something about the dog's demeanor made her hesitate. "It's not aggressive," she argued. "If anything, it seems gentle. Almost like it's looking for something." Mr. Lopez frowned. "Regardless, we need to find out where it's coming from and put a stop to it." That evening, Rebecca lingered at the hospital, determined to uncover the mystery. She waited near the main entrance, her eyes scanning the rain-soaked parking lot for any sign of the dog. Hours passed, and just as she began to think it wouldn't appear, she saw a shadow dart through the automatic doors. It was the dog. Its coat glistened with rain, and its movements were purposeful as it padded down the corridor. Rebecca followed at a distance, her curiosity outweighing her caution. The dog led her to the oncology ward, where it stopped outside a room and sat quietly. Rebecca stepped closer, peering inside. The room belonged to an elderly woman named Margaret, a long-term patient battling late-stage cancer. She was asleep, her frail body barely making an impression on the bed. The dog lay down near the door, its head resting on its paws as it watched her. Rebecca felt a lump form in her throat. "You know her, don't you?" she whispered. The dog didn't move, but its eyes flicked toward Rebecca, as if acknowledging her words. The next day, Rebecca began digging into Margaret's history, hoping to find a clue about the dog's connection to her. Margaret was a widow with no immediate family, her only visitors being volunteers from a local church. There was no mention of a dog in her file, but Rebecca's instincts told her there was more to the story. She decided to visit Margaret during her rounds. The elderly woman was awake, her eyes bright despite the toll of her illness. Rebecca sat beside her, choosing her words carefully. "Margaret," she began, "I wanted to ask you about something. Have you ever had a dog?" Margaret's face softened, a faint smile tugging at her lips. "Oh yes, Charlie. He was my everything." Rebecca's heart quickened. "Charlie?" "Yes," Margaret said, her voice wistful. "A sweet brown mutt with the kindest eyes. My husband and I adopted him when we first moved into our little house. He passed a few years ago, but I still think of him every day." Rebecca hesitated, then asked gently, Did Charlie ever come here with you? Margaret shook her head. No, dear. He hated car rides. But sometimes when I'm lying here at night, I dream of him. It's like he's right here with me, keeping me company. Rebecca felt a chill run down her spine. Could it be a coincidence? Or was the dog's presence something more than chance? Rebecca couldn't shake Margaret's words. The description of Charlie matched the dog perfectly. His brown coat, his gentle eyes, and the way he seemed to radiate quiet loyalty. But Charlie was gone, and Margaret had said he'd never been to the hospital. So how could this dog who appeared each night fit into the puzzle? That evening, Rebecca decided to stay late again, this time following the dog more closely. When the animal arrived, soaking wet from the rain, its movements were once again purposeful. It made its way to the oncology ward, stopping just outside Margaret's door before lying down. Rebecca crouched nearby, watching quietly. "Why do you keep coming here?" she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. The dog lifted its head, its eyes meeting hers. There was something in its gaze, something Rebecca couldn't define. It was as though the dog understood her question but couldn't answer it. Instead, it stood, stretched, and padded silently into Margaret's room. Rebecca followed, staying in the doorway. Margaret was asleep, her frail chest rising and falling in slow, steady breaths. The dog approached her bedside, its movements careful and reverent. It sat down and rested its head on the edge of the mattress, its eyes never leaving Margaret's face. The sight brought tears to Rebecca's eyes. The dog's presence was more than coincidence, it was devotion. But why? What tied this animal so deeply to a woman who claimed it wasn't hers? The next morning, Rebecca shared what she had seen with her colleague, Dr. Ethan Clark. Ethan was a practical man, known for his skepticism, but even he couldn't completely dismiss the story. "You're saying the dog just sits by her bedside?" he asked, his brow furrowed. Rebecca nodded. "Every night. It's like he's keeping vigil." Ethan rubbed his chin thoughtfully. "It could be something simple. Maybe Margaret reminds the dog of its owner, or maybe it's just seeking comfort." "Maybe," Rebecca said. "But what if it's more than that? What if the dog knows her?" Ethan raised an eyebrow. "You think it's Charlie?" "I don't know," Rebecca admitted. "But there's something about the way the dog looks at her. It's not random." Ethan sighed. "If you're right, we need to figure out where the dog is coming from. It's one thing to let it wander around, but if it's connected to a patient, we need to know." That afternoon, Rebecca began searching for answers. She contacted local shelters, veterinarians, and animal control, describing the dog in the hopes that someone might recognize it. Most people sympathized but had no information. Just as she was about to give up, she received a call from a shelter volunteer named Hannah. "I think I know the dog you're talking about," Hannah said. "We've seen him around the neighborhood for months. He doesn't belong to anyone, but he's not exactly a stray." Rebecca's interest piqued. "What do you mean?" "Well," Hannah continued, "he used to belong to an elderly man who lived alone. When the man passed away, the dog disappeared. No one could catch him. He just vanished." Rebecca's heart raced. "Do you know the man's name?" Hannah hesitated. "I think it was George Bailey. He lived in a small house near the park." Rebecca thanked her and hung up, her thoughts racing. Could George Bailey have been connected to Margaret? And if so, was this dog, a possible remnant of his life, still searching for something? That evening, Rebecca visited Margaret again. She brought up George Bailey gently, not wanting to overwhelm the older woman. "Margaret, do you remember a man named George Bailey?" she asked. Margaret's face lit up. "Oh, George. Yes, of course. He lived 2 streets over from me. Such a kind man." Rebecca leaned forward. "Did he ever have a dog?" Margaret's expression softened. "He did. A lovely dog named Charlie. I used to see them walking together every morning." Rebecca's breath caught. "Charlie?" Margaret nodded. "That's right. I always told him that our Charlies could have been brothers. They looked so alike." The pieces began to fall into place. George's Charlie must have been the dog now wandering the hospital. But why? Why had he chosen Margaret, of all people, to visit each night? "Margaret," Rebecca said gently, "did you ever take care of Charlie?" Margaret's eyes filled with tears. "When George got sick, yes. He asked me to watch Charlie for him. And after George passed, I tried to keep him. But Charlie, he wouldn't stay. He kept running away. I think he missed George too much." Rebecca's throat tightened. "Do you think he's come back for you?" Margaret smiled faintly. "Maybe he remembers. Maybe he knows I miss him too." That night, Rebecca stayed late again waiting for the dog. When it arrived, she greeted it softly, her voice filled with emotion. "You're Charlie, aren't you? You're still taking care of her." The dog's tail wagged faintly, and for the first time, it let Rebecca place a hand on its head. The connection was undeniable, a silent understanding that passed between them. Charlie wasn't just a stray. He was a guardian, holding on to the memory of the people he had loved. The revelation left Rebecca with a mix of awe and heartache. Charlie's story wasn't just one of loss, it was one of unyielding loyalty, the kind that transcends time and place. She knew she had to share this with Margaret, though she wasn't sure how the elderly woman would react. Would she believe that Charlie had come back for her? Or would it simply be too much for her to accept? Rebecca decided to take it slow. The next day, she visited Margaret again, bringing a small photo she'd printed from the hospital's security footage. It showed Charlie sitting near Margaret's door, his gaze watchful and calm. "Margaret," Rebecca said gently, "I wanted to show you something." Margaret adjusted her glasses and studied the photo. Her lips parted slightly, her hand trembling as she touched the edge of the picture. "That's Charlie," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "It's really him." Rebecca nodded. "He's been coming here every night. It's like he knows you're here." Tears welled in Margaret's eyes. "I thought I was dreaming. I thought, maybe it was my mind playing tricks on me. But he's real." "He's real," Rebecca confirmed. "And he hasn't forgotten you." Later that evening, Rebecca waited for Charlie's arrival. This time she had a plan. She wanted to see if Charlie would let her guide him to Margaret during her waking hours. When he arrived, slipping through the automatic doors as he always did, she crouched to greet him. "Hey Charlie," she said softly, holding out her hand. "Do you want to see her?" Charlie's ears perked up and he wagged his tail as if he understood. Rebecca led him to Margaret's room, her heart pounding as she gently knocked on the door. "Come in," Margaret called weakly. Rebecca opened the door and stepped aside to let Charlie enter. The dog moved cautiously at first, his movements almost reverent as he approached the bed. Margaret gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "Charlie," she whispered, tears streaming down her cheeks. "It's really you?" Charlie wagged his tail, his eyes bright and full of recognition. He rested his head on the edge of the bed, his tail thumping softly against the floor. Margaret reached out a trembling hand, her fingers brushing his fur. "Oh Charlie," she murmured. "I missed you so much." Rebecca stood back, her own eyes filling with tears as she watched the reunion. It was as if time had folded in on itself, bringing two souls back together in a moment of pure, unspoken love. Over the next few days, Charlie became a fixture in Margaret's room. The hospital staff, initially wary of allowing a dog to stay, quickly came to accept him after seeing the effect he had on Margaret. Her spirits lifted, her appetite improved, and for the first time in weeks she smiled and laughed. "It's like he's given her a reason to fight," Rebecca told Dr. Ethan Clark one morning as they observed Margaret from the hallway. "He's not just a dog. He's her connection to something bigger, her memories, her past, her heart." Ethan nodded, his skepticism softened by what he had witnessed. "It's incredible. You don't see this kind of bond every day." But Rebecca couldn't help wondering, what would happen when Margaret was no longer in the hospital? Would Charlie stay with her? Or would he disappear again as he had after George's death? She decided to broach the subject carefully. One afternoon, as Margaret sat with Charlie at her feet, Rebecca asked, "Margaret, have you thought about what comes next? About Charlie staying with you?" Margaret looked down at the dog, her expression bittersweet. "I'd love nothing more than to take him home. But I'm not sure I'll be going home, dear. Not in the way I'd hoped." Rebecca's chest tightened. "You don't know that. You've been doing better." Margaret smiled faintly. "Better maybe. But I've lived a long life, Rebecca. And I think Charlie knows that. He's here to see me through." That night, Rebecca stayed at the hospital, unable to shake Margaret's words. The idea that Charlie was here not just as a companion but as a guide, someone who had come to help Margaret find peace, filled her with both awe and sorrow. As she sat in the quiet of her office, she heard a soft knock at the door. It was Nurse Lydia, her face pale. "Dr. Harper," Lydia said, her voice trembling. "It's Margaret. She's asking for you." Rebecca's heart raced as she followed Lydia to Margaret's room. When she entered, she found Margaret lying peacefully, Charlie at her side. The elderly woman's breathing was shallow, her face serene. "I wanted to thank you," Margaret said softly, her eyes shining with a mixture of sadness and gratitude. "For bringing him back to me." Rebecca knelt beside her, tears streaming down her face. "It wasn't me, Margaret. It was Charlie. He never gave up on you." Margaret reached out to touch Charlie's fur one last time. "Good boy," she whispered, her voice barely audible. You've always been a good boy. Charlie wagged his tail gently, his gaze fixed on Margaret as if he understood the moment's gravity. The room was quiet except for the soft hum of the machines monitoring Margaret's vitals. Rebecca stayed at her bedside, holding Margaret's frail hand. Charlie didn't move from his spot, his head resting gently on the edge of the bed. There was an unspoken understanding between the three of them, a connection that didn't need words. As the hours passed, Margaret's breathing grew slower, her chest rising and falling with effort. Yet, her face remained peaceful, a soft smile lingering on her lips. Rebecca leaned closer, her voice breaking as she whispered, "You're surrounded by love, Margaret. It's okay to rest now." Charlie let out a soft whine, his tail thumping once against the floor. Margaret's hand twitched, her fingers brushing his fur one last time. With a deep, final breath, Margaret slipped away, her spirit leaving the room in a quiet, gentle release. Rebecca felt tears stream down her face as she squeezed Margaret's hand, her heart heavy yet full of gratitude for the life she had been part of. Charlie remained at the bedside, his eyes fixed on Margaret's still form. He didn't bark or whine. He simply stayed there, his presence a silent tribute to the woman he had come to guide. The next morning, the hospital staff gathered to honor Margaret's memory. Word of her connection to Charlie had spread, and many of the nurses and doctors were moved by the loyalty of the dog who had appeared each night to watch over her. Rebecca made arrangements to have Charlie cared for until she could figure out his next steps. But to her surprise, when she tried to lead Charlie away from the hospital, he resisted. He sat firmly at the door to Margaret's room, his eyes filled with quiet determination. It was as though he was waiting for something. Rebecca knelt beside him, her voice soft. "She's gone, Charlie. You did everything you could for her. She loved you." Charlie looked at her, his gaze unwavering. Then, slowly he stood and walked toward the door. Rebecca followed, unsure of what he was trying to show her. Charlie led Rebecca out of the hospital and into the morning light. The air was crisp, and the streets were quiet as he padded purposefully toward a small park nearby. Rebecca followed, her heart heavy but curious. At the edge of the park, Charlie stopped. He sniffed the ground, his tail wagging faintly as he sat down. Rebecca looked around, trying to understand what had drawn him here. Then she saw it, a small bench beneath a flowering tree. On the bench was a plaque that read, "In loving memory of George Bailey and his beloved dog, Charlie. Together forever." Rebecca's breath caught in her throat. This was where George and Charlie had spent their mornings, their bond unbroken even in death. And now, it seemed, Charlie had brought Rebecca here to find closure, not just for Margaret but for himself. She knelt beside him, her hand resting gently on his back. "Is this where you wanted to be?" she asked softly. Charlie wagged his tail, his eyes bright as he looked up at the bench. He lay down at its base, his body relaxed for the first time since Rebecca had met him. It was as though he had found his home. In the days that followed, Rebecca worked with a local rescue organization to ensure Charlie was cared for. Though many people offered to adopt him, Rebecca couldn't bring herself to let him go. He had become a part of her life, his story forever entwined with Margaret's and George's. She brought Charlie home, where he settled into his new life with quiet grace. He seemed content, no longer wandering the streets or searching the hospital halls. It was as if he knew he had done his part, that his journey, though filled with loss, had brought love and comfort to those who needed it most. Years later, Rebecca often thought of Margaret and George as she sat in the park with Charlie. The bench beneath the flowering tree had become a place of reflection, a reminder of the enduring bonds that connect us across time and space. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Rebecca leaned down to scratch behind Charlie's ears. "You've taught me so much," she said softly. "About loyalty, love, and what it means to truly care for someone." Charlie wagged his tail, his golden eyes filled with the same gentle understanding he had shown from the very beginning. And in that moment, Rebecca knew that the spirits of Margaret and George were at peace, their lives forever touched by the dog who had never stopped loving them. Charlie adapted seamlessly to his new life with Rebecca. Though his age began to show in his graying muzzle and slower steps, his spirit remained as bright and loyal as ever. Rebecca, too, found that her life was irrevocably changed by the time she spent with him. It wasn't just the events at the hospital that stayed with her, it was the lesson Charlie had taught her, that love in its purest form knows no boundaries. Rebecca began taking Charlie to the park every evening, visiting the bench where George's plaque was displayed. It became a ritual, a quiet moment where she felt connected to something larger than herself. She would sit beside Charlie, watching the sky change colors as the sun set, her thoughts drifting to Margaret and the bond she had shared with the loyal dog. One evening as they sat in the park, an elderly couple approached the bench. They paused when they saw Charlie, their faces softening with recognition. "Is that Charlie?" the woman asked, her voice trembling with emotion. Rebecca nodded, surprised. "You know him?" The man smiled, his eyes misting. "We were neighbors of George Bailey. We used to see him walking Charlie every morning. After George passed, we tried to help care for Charlie, but he wouldn't stay. He just disappeared." Rebecca gestured for them to sit. "He found his way to Margaret, another neighbor of George's. He stayed with her until," she hesitated, her voice thick, "until her last moments." The woman reached down to pet Charlie, her hands gentle. "George used to say Charlie was more than just a dog. He believed Charlie had a purpose, that he could sense things most of us couldn't." The man nodded. "Looks like George was right." The couple shared stories of George and Charlie, painting a vivid picture of the life they had shared. George, it turned out, had been a kind and quiet man, someone who found joy in simple things. Walking Charlie, tending to his garden, and chatting with neighbors. His bond with Charlie had been unshakable, and even after George's passing, the dog had carried that loyalty forward, searching for a way to honor the man who had meant so much to him. As Rebecca listened, she realized that Charlie's story wasn't just about Margaret or George, it was about the threads of connection that tied them all together. Charlie had been the guardian of those memories, the keeper of love that had endured across time and space. Rebecca decided to honor those connections in a way that would ensure their stories were never forgotten. She worked with the park's board to install a second plaque beside George's. This one read, "In memory of Margaret and the dog who loved her. May their bond inspire us all." The plaques, side by side beneath the flowering tree, became a place where visitors would pause and reflect. Charlie, too, seemed to sense the significance. He would often rest beneath the tree, his eyes scanning the horizon as if watching over the space that had come to mean so much. As the years passed, Charlie grew older, his steps slower but his spirit as devoted as ever. Rebecca cherished every moment with him, knowing that their time together was finite but meaningful. When the inevitable day came and Charlie passed peacefully in his sleep, Rebecca felt both heartbreak and gratitude. He had lived a life filled with purpose, love and loyalty, touching more lives than most humans ever could. Rebecca laid Charlie to rest in the park, near the bench where he had spent so many quiet evenings. The plaques now told the story of not just George and Margaret, but also Charlie, a dog whose heart had been big enough to carry them all. In the years that followed, Rebecca often visited the park, sitting beneath the tree and reflecting on the lessons she had learned. She thought of George's quiet kindness, Margaret's enduring strength, and Charlie's unwavering devotion. These stories weren't just memories, they were reminders of what it meant to truly care, to love without condition, and to leave the world a little brighter than you found it. Rebecca found herself sharing Charlie's story with others, patients, colleagues, and even strangers who happened upon the bench in the park. Each time, she saw the same look of wonder and connection, as though Charlie's legacy was still working its quiet magic, bringing people together long after he was gone. One evening, as Rebecca sat beneath the flowering tree, she closed her eyes and felt the warm breeze brush against her skin. She imagined Charlie sitting beside her, his golden eyes watching the horizon. In that moment she felt a deep sense of peace. "Thank you, Charlie," she whispered, her voice carried on the wind. "For everything." The sun dipped below the horizon, casting the park in golden light. And though Charlie was no longer by her side, Rebecca knew his spirit was everywhere. In the tree, the bench, and the hearts of those whose lives he had touched. The bonds he had created, the love he had shared, and the lessons he had taught would endure, reminding everyone who heard his story that love, loyalty, and connection could truly transcend anything. It had been several weeks since Charlie's passing, and Rebecca found herself returning to the park more often than ever. The bench under the flowering tree had become a refuge, a place where she could sit and reflect on everything that had happened. Though Charlie was gone, his presence lingered, an invisible but undeniable warmth that seemed to fill the air around the bench. One stormy evening, Rebecca found herself drawn to the park despite the heavy rain and the rumble of thunder in the distance. She brought her umbrella, though it did little to shield her from the downpour. Something about the storm felt symbolic, like a chapter of her life was shifting, and she needed to confront it. When she reached the bench, the sight stopped her in her tracks. There, sitting in the rain, was another dog, a scruffy, wiry mutt with matted fur and soulful eyes. It looked up at her, its body trembling from the cold, but its gaze was steady, almost expectant. Rebecca's breath caught in her throat. "What are you doing here?" she whispered, her voice barely audible over the storm. The dog didn't move, its wet fur clinging to its thin frame. There was something hauntingly familiar about its posture, its quiet determination. Rebecca felt a shiver run down her spine, and not from the cold. She crouched down, holding out a hand. "It's okay," she said gently. "I won't hurt you." The dog sniffed her hand cautiously before leaning into her touch. Its body was frail, its ribs visible beneath its damp coat. Rebecca's heart broke at the sight. "You're lost, aren't you?" she murmured. "Just like Charlie was?" As she spoke, the dog let out a soft whine and glanced toward the bench. Rebecca followed its gaze and froze. There, etched into the wooden surface of the bench, were claw marks, new ones, deep and deliberate. The sight sent a chill through her, a feeling she couldn't quite explain. Was it a coincidence? Or was this dog connected to Charlie somehow? Rebecca decided to take the dog home, unable to leave it out in the storm. She wrapped it in her coat and carried it to her car, her mind racing with questions. Once home, she dried the dog off and gave it food and water, watching as it devoured the meal hungrily. "You've been through a lot, haven't you?" she said softly, stroking its damp fur. The dog looked up at her, its eyes filled with an emotion she couldn't place. Gratitude, perhaps, or something deeper. Rebecca couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't random. The dog's appearance at the bench, its gaze, and the claw marks all felt connected to something larger, something she didn't yet understand. The next day, Rebecca returned to the park, her thoughts heavy. She examined the bench more closely, running her fingers over the fresh claw marks. As she did, she noticed something she hadn't seen before, a faint carving in the wood, almost obscured by time and weather. It read, "For the ones who watch over us." Rebecca's chest tightened. She had never seen the inscription before, but it felt like a message, a reminder of Charlie, Margaret, and even George. And now, this new dog seemed to be part of the same story, carrying a legacy that refused to fade. That night, Rebecca couldn't sleep. The storm had returned, lightning illuminating the sky as rain lashed against her windows. She sat in her living room with the dog curled at her feet, her thoughts racing. Why had it appeared now, just as she had begun to find closure? What was it trying to tell her? The dog lifted its head suddenly, its ears perking up. It let out a low growl, its body tense. Rebecca's heart raced as she followed its gaze to the window. There, illuminated by a flash of lightning, was a shadowy figure standing beneath the tree in her yard. She froze, her breath catching. The figure was indistinct, almost ghostly, but its posture was familiar, too familiar. "Charlie?" she whispered, her voice trembling. The figure didn't move, but the dog at her feet barked sharply, breaking the spell. When Rebecca looked again, the figure was gone, replaced by the swaying branches of the tree. The next morning, Rebecca returned to the park, determined to find answers. As she approached the bench, she noticed a group of people gathered there, their faces somber. A woman stepped forward, her eyes red from crying. "Are you Dr. Harper?" she asked. Rebecca nodded, her stomach twisting. "Yes. Why?" The woman held out a photo, a grainy image of the scruffy dog Rebecca had taken in. "That's my father's dog. He passed away last month and we haven't been able to find him since." Rebecca's heart sank. "I found him at the park last night." The woman nodded, tears streaming down her face. "He always came here with my dad. It was their favorite place. I think he's been waiting for him." Rebecca's breath hitched. Another dog, another story of loss and loyalty tied to this park. The pieces began to fall into place. The bench wasn't just a memorial for George and Margaret. It had become a sanctuary for those left behind, a place where love endured even in the face of loss. Rebecca stood in stunned silence, the woman's words echoing in her mind. Another dog, another guardian bound by loyalty and love. It wasn't a coincidence. This park, this bench, had become something sacred, a place where the bonds between people and their dogs endured beyond time and space. "I think he came to me for a reason," Rebecca said softly, looking down at the scruffy dog by her side. "Maybe he knew I'd bring him back to where he belonged." The woman knelt, reaching out to the dog. "Hey there, buddy," she whispered, her voice trembling. The dog sniffed her hand before leaning into her touch, his body relaxing as if recognizing a piece of the family he had lost. Tears streamed down her face as she looked back at Rebecca. "Thank you for bringing him here. My dad, he would have wanted this." Rebecca nodded, emotion tightening her throat. "He's part of this story now. Part of all of it." That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Rebecca returned to the bench one last time. The park was quiet, bathed in the soft glow of twilight. She sat beneath the flowering tree, her thoughts heavy with the weight of everything that had happened. She thought of George and Margaret, of Charlie and the scruffy dog, and of the invisible threads that connected them all. This wasn't just a park, and the bench wasn't just a memorial, it was a testament to the enduring power of love, a reminder that the bonds we share with others, human or animal, never truly fade. Rebecca closed her eyes, letting the cool evening breeze wash over her. In the stillness she felt something, a presence, a warmth that wrapped around her like a gentle embrace. She opened her eyes and for a brief moment she saw them. Charlie sitting beside George beneath the tree. Margaret, her hand resting on Charlie's head, her smile radiant. And the scruffy dog, now reunited with his family, wagging his tail in quiet contentment. The vision faded as quickly as it appeared, but Rebecca's heart swelled with peace. She stood, her gaze fixed on the bench and whispered, "Thank you for everything." The following week, Rebecca worked with the park's board to update the plaques beneath the tree. They now read, "In loving memory of George and Charlie, guardians of the morning walks. For Margaret and the dog who never left her side, a love that endures. To all the bonds that transcend time and space, this bench is for you." The additions became a focal point of the park, drawing visitors who came to reflect, to honor, and to share their own stories of love and loss. Rebecca often saw people sitting on the bench with their dogs, their quiet moments of connection filling the park with an energy she couldn't quite describe but knew was sacred. Years later, Rebecca continued to visit the park, her own life deeply shaped by the lessons she had learned there. She had become a voice for those who couldn't speak, an advocate for the bonds between humans and animals that so often went unacknowledged. And every time she sat on the bench, she felt them, George, Margaret, Charlie, and all the others who had found their way back to the ones they loved. Their presence lingered in the quiet rustle of the leaves, in the warmth of the sun filtering through the branches, and in the hearts of those who carried their stories forward. As Rebecca stood beneath the flowering tree one evening, she placed a hand on the bench and closed her eyes. "This place will always be yours," she whispered. "Thank you for showing me what it means to love without limits." The wind stirred the leaves above, carrying her words into the sky. And as the sun set, painting the park in hues of gold and amber, Rebecca smiled, knowing that the bonds forged here would never be broken.
you.